Welcome to Crossing Faiths, where a Christian and a Muslim speak religion and politics. This session. We don't have Matthew Hawkins, where he's on hiatus. I think he's on doing some schoolwork. And we have my good friend and colleague, Manal Omar from Across Red Lines today to talk about something that it's a sexy issue, but it's controversial. So we're going to talk about what's going on in France right now with some of the protests, the riots, and what it means to have a depiction of the prophet. Peace be upon him and his family. And I'm going to say that universally throughout this podcast so that if I miss it once or twice, it's completely covered. Welcome, Manal. We appreciate you taking the time and coming on the program again. How are you? How have you been?
I've been good, and thank you, John. Thank you for having me. I always just enjoy these discussions, so I'm doing great.
Well, I hope we can do a lightning round. I mean, I appreciate your advice and guidance. So here we have double Muslim, double gunning it on an issue that is very controversial, the depiction of the prophet and depictions of prophets in general. I can start right off with just framing the issue. College professor draws a caricature of the prophet in France. The members of the Muslim population didn't like it, and instead of productively addressing the issue, they cut off his head. So, and I just want to say right off the bat, there's absolutely, I don't understand it at all. And being a Muslim, I don't get it. There's nothing in the Quran that says that you need to murder somebody for depicting the prophet. I think you need to question yourself if you are cutting people's heads off, where you fit on the Islamic spectrum. And, once you start hurting people, and you and I talk about this all the time, what does the Quran say about hurting people? Mm-hmm. If you're hurting somebody, what happens to you I'm very, very clear about saying you start to cease to be Muslim. You start to be a lot less Muslim if you start killing people for particularly incidental reasons. But what's your take on that, Manal?
Well, I mean, I think what you started with is really important. I mean, like there is no religious argument, and I would take it outside of just the realm of Islam. Like I can't think of any religious tradition that would sanction such a level of violence. And, within the Islamic context, it's really clear, to take one life is to, attack all of humanity. We have no compulsion in religion. Like you don't even need to talk to a scholar. Like the verses in the Quran are so clear on this. But what I'd like to challenge us to do is to go beyond religion, because this is really an issue of how do you define national identity. And France is such an extreme in that definition that I think that we miss the root of conflict. And, again,
militant secularism.
It is. It's it's militant secularism built into white supremacy, right? I mean, the national identity of French is very much a white definition, and they want to ignore their colonial past and force every immigrant to ignore it as well.
Well, let's be honest. I mean, there's a whole other side of the lens here, and that is that most countries have abandoned their colonial past or is trying to rectify it. France is not. Francophile countries exist all over the world, and one of the things that I always try to explain is their colonialism is real, and that's a big part of this. Where if you go to Tunisia, let's just take none of the other Francophile countries that are out there, just Tunisia. You can only have French education. There's essentially an embargo on products. It's only French products, and there's very few of them. So if you go and shop for furniture, you'll get it'll be like 3 tables, and there'll be like 3,000 pounds or 3,000 francs. Their currency is French. Their military training is French, and like I said, their education system, even though you get a French education, it's worthless. When you go into France, the populations that are from the colonial powers still exist in ghettos. Yeah. So, and they have this, I can't remember the name of the law, but they got this law that's supposed to protect against religious minorities and allow them to integrate into government, but that's used against them. So, you go to any Francophile country, embargo, military, their military is embedded in their governmental systems, currency, everything is embedded in their systems still. And those Francophone countries are essentially colonial possessions. It's not even neo-colonialism. It's just straight on, full on colonialism. So,
Yeah. And I think like even if you just stay within the French borders, right?
right,
I mean, there's such a strong attempt to ignore any immigrant. And again, you're probably tired because I think every time I'm on your show, I'll talk about the social contract. I mean, at the heart of this
right,
is the need to talk about how does France want to view the sacred? Because this isn't just about Islam, it's really an understanding of the balancing of the sacred. And that's important for humanity, it's important for the spiritual side of things overarchingly beyond the Islamic context. How does, like I said, it want to address its colonial past? And again, French identity is rooted in white supremacy. And I urge us to look outside of religion. Like, let's look at the controversy of Blackface in France. I mean, you had this issue last year on campuses where African immigrants were saying this is almost globally agreed on as a very offensive part of
right,
historical
yeah,
theater.
yeah,
And the French came back, strongly defending it, and the professor, mocking his students to the point where you actually had to pull in,
yeah,
people who are, the academics in the race and ethnic world to be like, this is universally considered offensive. And the retort was, you're not French enough. And I think that if we're seeing it in the different contexts is just as much as drawing the prophet. And if this is what you want to defend, I mean, the French government's response is to replicate the cartoons and pass it out across high schools. So you're fighting fire with fire, you're escalating, rather than saying we actually have a trend. We're seeing how our African immigrants are deeply offended by what we call theater. We're
yeah,
seeing our Muslim population deeply offended. And rather than initiating a dialogue, which the French would be the first to lecture America about, we're going to escalate and hide behind this concept of freedom of expression, not understanding that all freedoms need negotiations
yeah.
and they all have an intersection of where we really need to continuously challenging the conversation. So I feel like France is being very lazy about its protection rather than going into depth. And for me, as an American, I feel like we have fallen into that trap. So it's sad to see France in the same trap as well.
Yeah, I'm gonna vacillate back and forth on both sides as I always do. My other side of it is that I just feel like the French are uniquely positioned to discuss the depiction of the prophet in a very thoughtful way, because they got the largest Muslim population in Europe. They got European Muslims that have part of that education system, the liberty, equality, and fraternity, and all that business. So they understand these concepts. The population, and they're uniquely positioned to have a dialogue about this. I mean, my always thing is, when I start hammering my Muslim brothers and sisters, go, well, you're pretty silent on the depiction of Hazrat Isa and Musa and all of the icons and all of the idol worship that's happening throughout the world. And then when it comes to the prophet, everybody wants to start cutting off heads, right?
Mhm.
So because the same rule applies to all prophets, it applies to everybody in Islam. So
That's true if you believe this is a religious argument. But I don't
right.
believe it
Well,
is.
I'm walking that line right now. I'm not interpreting religious text, but I'm pretty sure if you're cutting heads off because of the
A
depiction of the
thousand
prophet, you're wrong.
percent.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I question how Muslim you really are. I'll just be
Yeah,
honest with you.
I'm right there with you. And again, I think it really needs to be said as explicitly as you're saying it. So I'm really glad that you're saying it that clearly.
And
But
and like I said, this is not one of those things where you can say, well, tell me in the Quran. No, if
yeah,
you've read the Quran, then there's no possible way you would start cutting off people's heads for something so benign.
yeah,
And here's the thing: is it's a jihad al jung, right? So it's the jihad of the tongue. You should be vocalizing and walking someone through what needs to be done, and that's that's very Sunnah-esque and Hadith-esque. So
yeah.
that
But
gives you two elements, to work with. There's a lot of tools in Islam to start dealing with such matters without jumping to some kind of jackassery of mobilizing people to be mob justice.
yeah. No, and I think, I mean, so look, we've seen religion justify some horrible activity. In my adopted homeland, slavery was justified through the lens of religion.
Right.
We look at South African apartheid, like you were quoting scripture. You look at Burma, you've got Buddhist monks quoting scripture. And, for me, like for if Buddhism can be twisted towards violence, no religion is safe. And I think it's almost a red herring when we go and start, arguing these religious arguments, because there's a lot more in the root of conflict. And you can't find peace, you can't build bridges until you're brave enough to go into the root. And for France, I feel, like I said, just as dismissive as they are around the Muslim grievances, they've been dismissive around the Black immigrants grievances. And that for me is an indication it can't be all of us. There's something within the French national identity. And I would call it the myth of the French identity, because these people are as French as anyone else. That myth needs to be deconstructed. That myth needs to be discussed in a more open way. And, I'm just so disappointed to see the reaction to this is further escalation, further taunting of your own citizens. Like, you're not taunting foreign nationals. You're not taunting neighboring countries.
Yeah.
These are your citizens. And even, whenever time I've been in France, like, I'm consistently mocked for not drinking. I can't remember a visit in France where it doesn't become an issue and, you're so open-minded, you're so this, and it's like constantly a conversation. And it makes me sad to think of the people in France and how they may be mocked in a similar daily way. I remember the controversy over playing soccer. My entire youth is defined by basketball. I would, have been horrified if I was not allowed to play because I cover. And, those type of things, it's alienation. It's a different level of trauma. It introduces the trauma of separation. It's what we call in the trauma world dignity violations. And dignity violations are registered in the brain exactly as if you're physically hit. So there needs to be some ownership over this, controversy. And again, it's not just within the Muslim population. I think it really does a disservice to France to limit it only to a religious or an Islamic argument. There's so much more at play.
Well, I think we also have Macron made the statement that, that to fight Islamic extremism, and the idea, it's reminiscent of 9/11. Remember 9/11? It's like anybody who had a reasonable argument about, or a reasonable proposal, let's bring the Muslim population, and they would say, and you would just have to say 9, and people would lean in 11, and then that was it. And everybody be jumping on the other side. So it's like, come on, everyone's fighting Islamic extremism. Like, this is what I want to say to the president. Everybody's fighting Islamic extremism. Yeah. Everybody's fighting religious extremism. Everybody's fighting far-right extremism. We're all doing that already. So this, like, what, by stating that, it's a non-statement. But because we're already acting, we all have counterterrorism, we all have all this stuff, we can pour more money into it. But this is more of a social issue. And when we're talking about, there's a way to discuss things and be sensitive. And I deal with a lot of these religious freedom organizations, Religious Freedom Institute and 21st Century Wilberforce and a lot of the global organizations. And the Catholics have a very well-established tradition of religious freedom. We're not going to get into the contradictions of that, but they do. And so there's mechanisms within the Catholic identity, which is associated with France, right? And the Catholic history about muddling into these issues and noodling them over in a thoughtful way. And when you talk about the largest population in France, it's like, why don't you use those mechanisms? What's the problem? So you're talking about the idea to escalate. You make a statement about extremism, then you're talking about distributing such things. It's like, look, we've already done it. Like we had this conversation before. South Park depicts the prophet all the time as this like glowing light, And so it's which I always, when they have I don't know, it's the Wonder Team. I can't remember what it's called, but they got all the, and so, that you can access that episode everywhere right now. And so I think that there needs to be some conversation about, okay, we have this sort of visceral and very emotional response to the depiction of the prophet. My stance is, well, no one cares about all the other prophets in Islam, and everybody freaks out. So that's always been my stance with my Muslim brothers and sisters. They're like, well, how come you don't freak out about the statues of Isa and all these other, what's the problem? So you seem to be able to very accepting of that, but then all of a sudden you're it's an egregious issue when it comes to Muhammad. So why can't we figure out how to bridge that gap as Muslims? That's on us, and then talk about what's going on. Like there hasn't been a lot of response from the Muslim leadership, from the Ummah on this, which is always a big thing. And then I always get hammered in the rooms that I'm in. Well, Muslims don't say anything. Here some guy gets his head cut off, and there's no response from the Muslim community.
Yeah, but that whole thing kills me. Because I wanted
you to comment about that. I wanted to poke the bear a little bit because.
when I was, working with the Obama administration, like that was the line, like, where are the moderates? Where are the moderates? And I'm like, we're everywhere. We
Right,
just don't look like your stereotype,
right.
because they have a stereotype of what a Muslim would be. And so, like, and you've said this yourself, like, you'll be called the unicorn, or you're called, we're over exceptionalized as the unique when we're actually the norm. So there's this stereotype of what a moderate Muslim should look
Yeah,
like. There's a totally false understanding of who actually holds moral authority in the Muslim community.
right.
And the people who tend to be propagated, it's usually done by the West. I mean, like, we don't give the extremists the platform that sometimes I find like Western governments and Western
Absolutely.
countries giving. So there's a whole stereotype that's being played to when it comes to Muslim engagement. There's a whole industry that has been developed as a result, which is just by nature becomes false and artificial, just because it's not an organic representation. And so in that regards, I really resent when they say, well, where are the Muslims? The Muslim moderates aren't speaking, and where are the voices? I think that's why one of the books I helped publish with the U.S. Institute of Peace, edited by Robin Wright, is called "The Islamicists Are Coming."
Yeah, I
And in
worked with
there,
Robin Wright. She worked, was a big part of us AIC, and we were part of
yeah,
that book with the interviews on that
yeah.
book. Yeah,
Yeah, and so I mean and we did the title so provocative to show here's where the Islamic voices actually are. You don't have to guess; they're actually very vocal, and they're not all extremists. But I want to go back to the example of blackface. Like, if this, it's not just that blackface is offensive; it's offensive to a targeted group who has suffered at the hands both of Europe and the US. And there's so many grievances. And going back to the concept of dignity violations. So to further target a group that has been humiliated, that has been exploited, that has been marginalized in your national history, I think that is just, again, a very weak response from government in not owning its national past. And
right.
France in particular, I think, is very guilty. And like you said, there are still countries
Present.
across the continent that are still taxed by France because of colonialism.
Yeah,
And when you look at the brutality, I mean, you look at the continent, the concept of cutting off heads was introduced by the French into Algeria. So like this history, this, guillotine fashion of justice was actually spread through the continent by the French. And, that refusal to own the own national history, I think, will just create more and more disenfranchised, again, not only with the Muslim immigrants, but with the Black immigrants and other people who are actually helping build the future of France.
yeah. I mean, it's they just so uniquely positioned to address this issue in a thoughtful way, and it's like they're blowing it, blowing it.
I don't think they had the tools. I mean, again, I think France is one of the most hostile spaces for the sacred. I wouldn't even just say for Islam or religion, but for anything sacred. There's a real hostility towards the sacred. And you can't really have a real dialogue until you have an appreciation. And the sacred, could be freedom of liberty. I mean, that is sacred to national identity. So like,
Liberty, fraternity, equality. That was
and
the battle cry of the French Revolution. When I took French
yeah,
Revolution with Jerry White, in in my that was the battle cry. And so the idea is for that to ever be expanding, but we all know where that came out of. It came out of the great, the terror. So the idea of they just got rid of everybody from
mhm.
before with the guillotine, and so there needed to be radical change for that to happen, and we all know that the French are very passionate people. So maybe I'm not saying that needs to happen. I'm saying that they have the tools right now within the construct of their constitution, within the construct of their laws, within the construct of the identity of the French people, which is
You know,
wonderfully thoughtful. Um,
one of the
they have it.
campaigns, yeah, I mean, one of the campaigns across Red Lines ran with Sisterhood of Salam Shalom was Our Choice, Not Yours, about the burkini ban. And we actually traveled with a delegation to France. And it was actually a Holocaust survivor who called me and she said, don't ignore this. And I probably would have ignored it. And she said, I remember my first memory at 6 was not being able to swim in Berlin. And she's like, that's my first memory of how this all started.
Hmm.
So she's like, don't ignore this. And I think this is where I get frustrated. I'm a really, I always talk about my adopted homeland and how much I believe in integration in America. I'm proud of America. as a Palestinian, there were countries who would not accept my parents. America is one of the few people who gave my parents citizenship. We would be paperless without it. Or half my family would be paperless without it. And so the idea of immigrants pushing a country to evolve should be appreciated. It shouldn't be something that's seen as negative. And I think that's where the missed opportunity for France is. And when we try to integrate, we're pushed back. So integration is fully on the white mainstream definition of what it looks like. And if you're wearing a bikini, if you drink alcohol, you're not welcome into the mainstream. You're actually mocked and penalized. And I think that needs to be discussed, is we're trying to integrate and you're not letting us.
Yeah, there was when there was the ban on coverings and stuff like that. We worked with very closely with USERF to have a special category made, because it wasn't country particular concern. They couldn't do that, but they had a special category in between. And that was way back in 2011, 2012 when we did that. And it was worthwhile because it helped with the mechanisms of negotiation, because it set a criteria. Okay, you're not a country of particular concern, you're not on the watch list, but there are areas of concern. And then there was this special category, which I can't remember at this point. And they've eliminated that in USERF, which is a shame, but it allowed for it not to escalate to a point where it has to. I worked with the genocide people, so there's the United to End Genocide, and there was Save Darfur and all this other stuff, and you worked in Darfur as well. And I once asked, I said, well, how do we know it's genocide? How do we know? And they had a criteria, and the criteria was, well, if 10,000 people or more die, then it's genocide. And I go, well, what happens if it's 3,000? And what happened? So Kamdesh, which is Nuristan now, right, which was known as Kafiristan, there's maybe the Kalasha people, there's maybe 11,000 Kalasha people, right? Left 12,000 Kalasha people, and there's maybe a few people that only speak, Nuristani in that specific dialect. And the problem is like, if you have 3,000 people drop dead, that's half the population. So defining a threshold that's so high that by the time it gets there, the issue's over with, or it's so egregious that it has to be dealt with in a way in which you bring to bear all the resources that need to happen, when you could have alleviated this through dialogue and a conversation and a thoughtful process of, and I know this is your term from previous conversation, the reconciliation in some manner, shape, or form. It allows that, it's like I'm speaking Manal. All right, so, but
you don't have to be so resentful. It's a good thing. It's a good thing.
Well, you know what? There was a win for Johnny P. I always say you got to go backwards to go forwards, and I think you used that recently.
I do.
So that was a win. That was one of those.
Definitely.
So, but I think there's got, the problem is that we all wait until something becomes egregious, or the threshold is so high, and people say, well, we're willing to accept it until it gets to this point where it escalates. And it was like that with the genocide designation. I go, well, 10,000 is a terrible number because sometimes there's only 8,000 people.
It's funny that you say that, because you hit a real sensitive nerve here, and it's actually one of the reasons why I left government in the international arena. Was almost every conflict I saw and had to bear witness to was 100% preventable. We went and we flagged it. I'm on the ground very early on in conflict, and we would go in and we would flag it. I remember in particular, like Mosul and Anbar, and like we were flagging the rise of ISIS before ISIS became a threat.
Yes.
And so for me, like there's a whole real almost pain in the work that I've done over 25 years, because everything that I witnessed was preventable. I was in Khartoum with Darfur. I was in so many of these contexts.
The Chad River Basin. We knew ISIS was going there and to reoperationalize, and no one was listening to us.
And again, like my whole point of leaving because at that point I was with Oxfam, and then I joined the U.S. government because I very naively believed the decision makers need to know. I need to be at the table with the decision makers. And now after 8 years in the administration, they know, and they make whatever calculated decisions they need to make, which, I do not envy any leader who has to make these decisions.
Right. In many cases, it's the least worst decision. We all, I mean, those are the waters I swim in. I'm like, they have all these options, and sometimes it's the least worst because if they made this one, and I get that. I think we both get that.
Giving, I remember being, tongue in cheek, which I'm sure is very hard for you to imagine, at the end of the ISIS briefing. And this was like maybe 2006, 2007. And like, there were different terminologies for these extremist groups. But, I ended by saying, you can crush an ant today or you will fight an elephant tomorrow.
Right.
And I feel like that consistent decision, like you're saying, to wait for the 10,000 mark, and this is what Across Red Lines focuses on, is like, what can we do more in the world of prevention? Because the reality is, and it's not just government, even as citizens, there's so much we can do in the lens of prevention, and not enough funding, not enough thought, not enough of our great minds are in the preventative place. And again, that's just how the world of donors and money works. You have to have that emergency call fund with, slaughtered numbers escalating to actually get work done. But again, I think as citizens, we can do stuff in our immediate circle of influence that leads to prevention.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's part of why we're having this conversation. We're trying to figure out, someone's going to draft another cartoon.
Yeah.
And with
they're printing a booklet and making it mandatory in high schools. I mean, for the love of God, like, what a great reaction. Let's just incite everyone.
We're depicting something that can't be depicted, but we're using this depiction.
Yeah.
So, and this is it, that's so I just think it's kind of, you're right. It's such a French way of, tipping the iceberg in the wrong direction. But I think that we've got, so what's our recommendations on this one? And I'll be honest with you, I'm at this point, I'm like, I think for Muslims, what do we do? Our whole platform is looking internally, the intra-faith. And so one of the things we're going to start to do is probably establish a dialogue on how do we address issues like this. So, major offenses, how do we process them, and then how do we deal with the interfaith component from an interfaith from our intrafaith community, from the Ummah. And so it's something that I've always struggled with, because it's, there's a lot of people that will say on closed doors, well, you want to know what? You're right, John. Everything's fine. Everything's okay. But publicly they got to say, well, you want to know what? They did depict the prophet, and that's it. They knew what they were getting into.
Yeah. And I think that's my answer. I mean, I tend to have very super cheesy answers, but I do believe in the prophetic tradition. And one of my favorite hadiths is, you start from inside, like you start with yourself. And I think, those thoughts, those conversations, like you need to be really honest with yourself about them, because we all have them. I mean, I've been asked very frighteningly by people, like, I can't even say it. Like I still in my head can't even give words to certain thoughts that I've been asked. But like you said, we do speak from both sides of our mouths, and it can be really shocking and disappointing. I think especially for the youth, because I've been in the position where I know imams. I love that I keep trying to characterize myself as the youth, but like, my point being is, like, I've seen this in real play.
You as the youth. I'm way out there.
And I hear you say this, but I've witnessed it myself, where like there are these imams who are known for interfaith, and they're out in the public, and then in their own mosque or in their own families, they exhibit behavior or action and that's, youth watch action. They know empty words. They smell authenticity now. And because it's so lacking. So I think really working with yourself, and then your family, then your community, and then you go to the national level. And on the national level, I believe this is happening organically. I'd like to see more funding and more thought and design in it. We're in the process of negotiating social contracts. I love the eyebrow raise, but I
knew the social contract was going to come.
It's coming, and it will always come, because I think it is the absolute answer. And I mean, the previous social contract is based on this horrible Leviathan theory. There's this big monster that's coming for us, and if you give up your civil liberties, we'll protect you. And we're all like, here's our civil liberty. Like, we're going to give up all this stuff, and we're going to pay taxes. And 100 years later, the state has not delivered. It hasn't delivered in the way that it promised, and yet we've given so much up.
You sound so much. It sounds like hippie socialism.
No,
I don't know. But
again,
but I know it's not. I just saying it sounds like I sound like I'm talking to mom and dad right now, because my father's very passionate about these social contracts.
All I gotta say is you need to be listening to mom and dad more. So if that's the case.
Listen, I'm, the unicorn. And I'm starting to believe it now. I'm the guy who threads the needle between all the sides. But I agree with you. I think there needs to be. I think we need to take a step back and say, okay, look, there's acceptable. There's Islam is not black and white. Is not gray. It's black and white. There's very, very clear lines here on how to on the dignity of the human person. And the sanctity of life. And I'm using, Christian terms here. There's no precedent for something like this. And so in simple terms, if jumping to an extreme of murdering someone because of something you disagree with is just and which is the basic premise here, is insane.
It's insane. And it's not Islamic.
And it's criminal.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
And I know that you're big on the criminal camp. So so it's criminal. So there's a responsibility on the governmental side to address such social and criminal acts in a thoughtful way. And France has completely failed in this area.
Yeah.
And the president is reinforcing nonsense. So that's one side. And then with our community, the idea of making sure that there is a single and thoughtful narrative. And like I said, I don't speak for Islam. I never will claim that. My opinions are my own, and this isn't somebody else. Blah, 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 blah. But the thing is there's this. I'm backed by not only the Quranic verse, but I'm also backed by a social and moral norm that is part of living on the planet with other people. So, and I think that's where we get into the social contract stuff that you start talking about. It gets me a little nervous. I was like, I don't know. Are we talking Marxism? Yeah.
I mean, first of all, the social contract can't get more in terms of Western ideology than anything else. My only thing is let's shift it from a place of fear and scarcity to one of abundance. Again, like the social contract is a concept that is embedded in the creation of countries like France and across Europe and America. It's the essence of democracy, right? But yet it's still one that's based on fear and scarcity. And I think we need to rise above that. And that's where I get really excited about Generation Z and the millennials as they've begun that process of saying, we're not going to accept the story of limited resources and scarcity, and we're going to question distribution, and we're going to question the old institutions. And that's exactly what needs to happen. And I think that's why I keep trying to throw myself back into the youth camp, because that ideology is what I'd like to see more of.
You know me, so I'm like, I don't know, but we'll have to figure that out. Well, we'll meet in the middle. I mean, look, here's the thing. For anybody who wants to know, you want to know what reason why Muslims have a problem with any kind of it's idol worship. Any kind of depiction of prophets in general, and any kind of pictorial depictions, it's because it's idol worship. That's what it's considered. So that's the issue. Okay, and so once you start worshiping idols, it's an internal thing. So when you talk about the outside, there's no precedent for murdering people for idol worship. And depiction of your prophets is something that is there's an issue there when it comes to how in which someone is going to execute somebody of another faith, somebody outside the Ummah is going to be because they disagree with them on what they're doing. And like I said, we are in a world where there's idols all over the place from a Muslim perspective. We're surrounded by idols. Chances are if you're in a Western country, you're walking past an idol and surrounded by them right now. I'm looking at a church steeple right now, and I'm 90% sure there's Latin in there. If you ever drive past and it's some of my, if you're in New York City, which I just was, I went through a neighborhood and there was Marys all over the place. Mariam was surrounded by Mariams, So I was like, okay. So I wasn't, I just drove past. So I think we just need to think about how we're going to actualize something that is very dear to us, and something, and in the same respect, be able to vocalize and interpret that for other people. And I don't know if there's any kind of thoughtful dialogues that go on about this. USIP is really big on dialogues. I'm sitting here going, it might seem too parochial for someplace like USIP, but
Yeah.
how thoughtful would it be to discuss, faith and how faith is depicted and how that affects communities and how that actually motivates communities towards violence. So
Yeah.
that is something that's really hot, at least right now in France, and is something that keeps reoccurring. But it's something that we don't do because it's not sexy, and it's not something. Usually, it's these high points that crescendo and then subside, right? So,
Yeah.
but anyways, this is kind of the thought process that I'm thinking of, and maybe it's the same thing. Maybe it is about a social contract. I don't know. Maybe I am.
I mean, everything you just described is pretty much the process of the social contract.
Yeah,
So maybe I just
like
need to find a
I'm
new
almost at a
word.
Marxist now. That's it.
I don't understand why you're giving the social contract to the Marxists. Like
I have no
that's
idea. I
never
have no
been.
idea what I'm doing.
I'm
It's
like,
just, it's
I'm like, that's the
it's complete art.
antithesis.
It's just, I don't know. I'm thinking about it. I was talking to my father this morning, and
And I mean, look, I mean, social contract is the heart of religion. It's the heart of governance. It's, I mean, this is literally the interaction. It's the space in between relationships.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the essence. And, that's why the importance of negotiations comes in it. And it should be constantly negotiated. But if you don't like the term, we can figure out a new term. That's all
we're gonna use
good.
the term. I'm just giving you a hard time as I always do.
That's okay. I can clap back. I always promise.
I'm not bringing up the P word.
Yeah.
So.
Well, that's that's much appreciated. This is a controversial topic as it is.
So, but I appreciate you taking the time to discuss this because, like I said, I don't think there is a lot of conversation going on about it, and I think that there's a lot of religious figures that are able to provide clarity to the point where it's consistent within their community and outside the community. So there's two different messages, right? So. And that hurts us as a community. My message is, let's talk about it. My message is that both sides are wrong. My message is that you can get into the issue without being inflammatory. It's like the guy that wanted to burn a bunch of Qurans in Florida. It's like, what do you obviously you want to make a name for yourself. I mean, it's just as simple as that. And then you can go down the road of saying, well, why can't I? Well, anybody can do anything. But here's the thing: if you're talking about the dignity of the human person, which is my big thing, then that means that you got, and it's not that it's not yours, but if we're talking about dignity of the person, then first and foremost, we got to agree that this person has a right to live.
Yeah.
At a basic level. So I always, when I was there, I did dialogues with the Taliban and did stuff back in 2012. I was like, I was brought to, the State Department brought me to Afghanistan when there was a stalemate between the PRTs, provincial councils, and USAID. They bring me in. And I remember being in JBAD and they were talking about, they wanted this bridge. And I go, well, we want the bridge, and then we want Kabul to give us money for the bridge, and the governor's not doing this, blah, 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 blah. I said, well, here's the thing. Don't ask for the bridge. Ask for something really easy. Something very simple. Something that if they don't grant it, they kind of look dumb and stupid for not granting it. So like that would have been a really easy ask in this situation. It's like, you're depicting the prophet. You want to know what? How would you depict Jesus and this one and that one, and how would you, or whatever easy ask that you could go along with that would de-escalate this because they're not responding to something that's here, And I always said, and that was the thing. They started asking easy things. And when the provincial governor in Afghanistan started saying no, he kind of looked ridiculous. So then they were able to say, now we have a series of easy asks, not just the bridge, and this guy's not paying attention to us. And it's the same thing, I think, with this. We need to figure out a way to engage thoughtfully and without escalating into rioting and stuff like that. But I think a lot of this has to do with Corona. People are frustrated with Corona. People are being cooped up inside. There's a colonial past that is real, and there's a colonial present that's real. And then you have this idea of you're really hurting people when you're trying to say that I can do something that we know somebody's going to disagree with, but you want to know what, I'm doing it just because, and guess what, I'm going to do it in a really, really harsh and horrible way. Like the worst way I can. Think
But
about it.
it's also, there's the assumption that that dialogue hasn't, attempted to happen. Like, again, let's go back to what happened at Sorbonne University with the play and with Blackface. Like, the
Yeah,
students went to the student council.
yeah,
The students tried to have a conversation with the professor, and the university shut them down. The
yeah,
university called them anti-French.
yeah.
Now, fortunately, in France, there's a representative council of Black associations, so they had an organization and they were able to go, and the organization called for the boycott and took it to the news, so they had an outlet. But the accusation consistently was you're anti-French, you're anti-French national, and that was coming from Sorbonne University. I mean, if students and academics can't have that dialogue, which is usually this heat, especially in a country like France, the seat of these dialogues,
Sure.
and they were immediately shut down. Now, it doesn't justify violence in any way, but if you're not building into the structures the place for grievances to be aired and heard, then there is almost this, and you're shutting down dialogue, then you're fostering a fertile ground for extremism.
Yeah,
And I
without
think
a
that
doubt.
that's where the ownership across the 360, like we all have to own this. And again, going back to the US example, like that was my constant, and you've heard me say this in the last 4 years, is this isn't my battle. When ISIS, when Al-Qaeda, when these extremist groups stood up using my religion that I love dearly, to promote violence, I did see that as my moral responsibility to jump in.
Yeah,
But with white supremacy, I was looking around the same people asking me, where are the moderates? And being like, where's your voice now?
yeah.
Are you going to own your crazy?
Fair point.
Because
Yeah.
that's what needs to happen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a fair point. I always do this with, I joke back and forth with Matthew about this because, white supremacy to him is a criminal act.
Yeah.
So, and there is there, and they discount the Christian justifications for all this stuff. Cause faith is my world. Right. And I go, well, but it's the same thing. It's the same, you got the same God. There's very little difference between a guy holding a Quran with a ISIS flag behind him, all covered up with his guns, and then a guy that's sitting there with the Bible in his hand and a pickup truck, with whatever flag behind him. And I go, it's the same business.
Yeah.
But I think we're touching upon this issue, and I think that there's more. This isn't the first time people have said it, and I think it's growing now. And I think it speaks to our previous conversation about this, the Biden-Harris presidency. There's an opportunity here to start building on a reconciliation element, where we're talking about these issues and really identifying the core causes and what that identity looks like, and what's on the other side of that identity. It's all of us. It's all the moderates. It's all the people. And really, how do we navigate those waters where we can address domestic terrorism, whether it's in France, whether it's in America, or whatever, and what those motivations are. And I know that you're very keen on, and I am too, but more so in tune with this, is, domestic terror doesn't mean an explosion or an attack. It means there can be an emotional or psychological moment that crescendos into something that does turn violent, or will take a population and marginalize them to a point where it snowballs in trauma. Are you really proud of me at this moment?
Yeah, I
So,
feel like this is all our dialogues and conversations. This is a culmination.
I mean, I half-heartedly believe it because it's on my. No, I believe it. I'm just giving you a hard time. But I mean, like, that's not my circus, not my monkeys.
Yeah.
Psychological warfare certainly is, but not in the extreme implicitness that you're talking about, because there's the nuanced approach, and that's a psychological thing. Which
And that's good enough for me. Like, I don't need you to believe in it. I just need you to think about it.
well, I
And
know it
that's where I
exists.
think
I know it
we all
exists,
need to
and I know
do.
from psyops, from psychological operations, that I know that there's a way in which of doing it, but it's different when you're dealing with an enemy. It's another thing when you're different with your own citizenry, and that's and your neighbors.
Yeah.
There's a very different, if you share a fence with somebody and you're conducting psyops, psychological operations on them, and asymmetrical warfare, like I said, it helps when you have a defined enemy in a foreign country that's doing something. It's another thing when, counterterrorism or whatever you want to call it. It's another thing when you're sharing a fence line with somebody and you're conducting those operations, and your narrative and what ARL does is very astutely addresses these issues. and from a psychological, emotional, and intellectual component. And so maybe it sounds like I'm selling, but I don't own stock in ARL. So I wish I did, but I don't. So my stock doesn't go up if I sell it. But that's a very, I think, thoughtful way of depicting. What you said is a very thoughtful way of depicting it, and I'm saying it back to you in the way in which I received it.
Yeah.
So
Thank you. No, that's much appreciated, and I think a great summary. So thank you. And I mean, the other thing, and we talked a little bit about this with elections too, is like, don't like, I feel like don't underestimate the intergenerational that's happening as well, because like, like that's where I really also have concern is like we are separating within the households.
Yeah.
And going back to like, my background from the Middle East, like that's really when it becomes very hard to have those conversations, is when you see it around the dinner table, when you see it in the home. And I saw that across the Arab Spring, where like families could not have conversations because they really fell into different camps. And I
Yeah.
saw that in America in the last 4 years. We were just talking about how Thanksgiving, which is around the corner, was like a trigger for a lot of people. And a lot of my friends who, come from the Midwest or come from South Carolina were debating going back home. Like, do we go back home? Should we have, Friendsgiving? Because they didn't want to have that conversation. It was always the example of the crazy uncle, but like I think across the board, there was a real intergenerational challenge in terms of we want to be respectful, we love our family, but they do not hold our ideals, and we don't know how to face it and reconcile it.
Yeah, I'll have to invite you to a family dinner or holiday at the house, because you'll never see me more quiet than I'm at
Oh,
my parents'
wow. I
house.
want to see that.
I very rarely talk because it's just there's a lot of stuff slung at the table.
Yeah.
So yeah, so and it's yeah, so I get it. There's I'm when I come back home, I'm just my parents' son and my sister's little brother. So
Yeah.
that's so and I'm sure it's like that when you go home. And so I think when I was younger, I used to be frustrated with that, but there's a lot of comfort now and knowing that I'm not the center of anything.
Yeah.
So they
Yeah.
still look at me as a little kid, which is great, but I think you're right. There's the polarization between factions within families is real. I mean, in the Arab Spring, I saw it as well, and with a lot of the issues I deal with when it comes to this, Muslims from ARL has a very thoughtful way of doing this with your retreats and so forth. Muslims for Muslims, the whole idea is to be a transitional organization. The idea is that the elders and people like me provide the opportunity for the younger generations to have access and then take over essentially.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what the idea of the organization is. And one of the core purposes is to make sure that all the generations are able to speak and feel that it's a safe space to have that dialogue, regardless of the issue.
Yeah.
We'll probably tee up a couple topics about some of what's happening in France as well. But once again, Manal, I appreciate you taking the time. It's very thoughtful of you.
Thank you for having me. I always learn from you and enjoy these conversations. So thank you.
Well, I'm just becoming a Manal, voice piece now, and that's the thing. I mean, I'm not even, it's one of those deals where I'm saying the same terms now, so
Well, then I'm a very lucky woman, because to have someone like you echo the message is exactly my goal. So thank you for doing that. And thank you for always making sure my voice is heard. I appreciate that.
do you guys issue a card that has like, does the hammer and sickle? Do I get that?
Yeah.
Okay, I just get it. It's just a joke. Okay.
Horrible.
All right, so you're not socialist. We're not.
I know. It's like I feel like you need to go back to your civic engagement classes, Mr. Professor.
I'm coming off the heels of the
Because you're
election.
getting it all confused. You're getting it all confused.
It's going to come across that I'm conservative. I'm not. I'm just a guy just joking around. All right, so I once again really do appreciate you coming on board and talk about these issues and discussing them in a very thoughtful manner. This has been Crossing Face. It's a production of Muslims for Muslims International, Roll Top Productions. We will have a number of links in this episode. And once again, we have a campaign that's called Let Love In. Let Love In is, and we would love to have some Muslims and other faith groups, and particularly Frenchies, to get involved and do a couple
Absolutely.
Yeah, do a couple of videos on maybe talking about some issues, or maybe just what's the, I'm gonna say the P word. What's the Palestinian dance? What's it called?
The depka, yeah,
Yeah,
that
let's do a little, why can't we have a little bit of that? I think we get a little bit of some of the social dances, they're all the same. They're all just
I
stepping
mean,
and jumping with small vests. But
yeah.
you
You
know,
know, I always tell people, like, we dance like we pray, in groups and shoulder to shoulder. It's not about that individual waltz. It is about the community coming in. So there's a beauty in how we dance. So I'm proud of our Depka.
well, I think we should get some of that business on. But like I said, thank you so much for taking the time, and I appreciate it
Thank you.
so much.